Good. How are you?
The History Channel, an intellectual's paradise, teaching the average American about everything there is to know about history. Who really built the pyramids? Who really is driving the trucks in Alaska? How do you really smith those swords? Yes, indeed, this is one of the most, if not the most, valuable sources of learning in all of human history. Truly a modern library of Alexandria. But, unfortunately, even our most stalwart of scholars can sometimes make an occasional mistake. America, the story of us. I remember watching this documentary in the 5th grade, the Revolutionary War bit of it anyway. The American Revolution is the most important and yet is also one of the most popularized and misconceived events in all of American history. Of course, when I was a dumb elementary schooler, I didn't know that. The extent of my knowledge on the subject went only as far as movies like The Patriot and games like Empire Total War. So naturally, my underdeveloped Neanderthal brain took everything in it as factual and reliable. Oh boy. But when I randomly remembered and decided to rewatch this documentary the other day on YouTube, I couldn't help but cringe and laugh at how god-awful and horribly wrong everything in it is. I'm not making this video to jab at America. I'm making it because I find the popularism surrounding the Revolutionary War to be insulting, particularly to the Continental Army and really the British in general. And also just because this is a laughable attempt at education, and it should be called out. This is America, the Story of Us. So despite that flashy intro, this is actually going to be a fairly typical reaction type video, I would say. It kind of harkens back to when I did that video on the worst song in the world way back when. I'm basically just going to be going through episode 1 and episode 2 of America, the Story of Us, and I'm just going to be like talking about just some stuff that's wrong, really. Misinformation, more mythological stuff than factual stuff, typical, like, nerd stuff, basically. But we're going to be starting off at, like, the last 10 minutes of the first episode and just going throughout the second episode, and we'll just be talking about stuff, so, yeah, let's just get into it, I guess. So, basically, we're going to start off here with the Battle of Lexington, and we're going to go up all the way until the Battle of Yorktown in episode 2. Oh boy, am I excited.
By 5 in the morning, 60 militiamen line up.
And we already have a small issue. So he said that 60 militiamen have lined up on the Lexington Green on the morning of April, that infamous April morning. Actually, in reality, it would have been much more than 60 men. In fact, many sources place it as little as 80 men, and some contemporary British sources will cite as many as 200 men on the Lexington Green, although I personally doubt that the numbers ever would have been that high. But definitely like 80 to 100 men is a much better statistic to put up on screen than 60. That's not a very big issue, that's a very small issue, but don't worry, we'll get into some juicier ones later, mark my words.
The Lexington militia gathers on the village common, dairy farmers and shopkeepers. But also among them are free African Americans and slaves.
Alright, now this is actually a point that I'm kinda mixed on. On one hand, I really do like that they're giving attention to the role of African Americans in the American Revolution. They actually do this a few times throughout the documentary. But, on the other hand, I kinda question their motive to do so, because at no point in either episode 1 or 2 do they ever mention the fact that most of the African Americans who fought for the Americans, that many of them were never granted the freedom they were promised. Nor do they ever talk about the African Americans who signed up with the British, for example, for the same reasons, freedom. Many of them were never given their freedom either. So, I don't know, it's like they talk about African Americans just to praise America, and to not actually pay attention to the history that is there, which, that's bad, and I wish they kind of did the subject more justice. Oh my god, this is one of the worst. Actually, no. This is the worst portrayal of the Battle of Lexington and Concord that I've ever seen in my life. It shows like this kind of like Western-esque style of like standoff between the British and the militia. And then all of a sudden the British just fire. They're given the order to like volley fire onto the Americans. That is very far from what happened. So, make a long story short and all that. What happened is that the American militiamen, they were on the green, right? You have this force of American militia. They're lined up like a typical like regiment would have been. And what happened is you had the British march onto the green. You had a detachment of the British forces, the British light infantry. They marched onto the green and they were given the order to disperse the militia. It was very much how you would disperse a riot in a way. And we all know the story from there. The American militia, they did attempt to disband very briefly, but then a shot rang out and all hell just broke loose. Discipline among the British just broke down. They lunged into the Americans with their bayonets. A few shots were fired at them and several Americans lay dead just because of a complete lack of discipline. That is not shown here. Here it's just shown the British just fire at the Americans and the Americans run. Wow, that was a very fucking awful noise that destroyed my eardrums. Now they fix bayonets after they fire a volley. And for whatever reason, this guy has blood on his face. Then they fix their bayonets, and then they charge. Alright, I got you. They give a lot of the Americans this brown jacket with red facings. I guess to symbolize that they're militia. These were not militia uniforms. These were regular Continental Army uniforms. I forget the name of the exact regiment who used them. I think they were either a New York or a New Jersey regiment. But yeah, the brown coat with red facings, that was a professional Continental Army coat. The militia should not be wearing them.
Gunsmith and militia leader Isaac Davis takes a bullet through the heart.
Hey, that's actually a really good tidbit there. That is absolutely 100% true. It would be better, though, if the setting was right. The initial sort of Battle of Concord, and where Isaac Davis was killed, was on a bridge. They should be fighting on a bridge. But, nah, that's too difficult. Let's just fight them on a hill or something. And instead of forming ranks and firing by volley or firing by file, for example, the British just kind of retreat after fighting in an open field. The British just retreat. Kind of contradicts that whole narrative of the British being the best army in the world.
Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field, it's madness.
And now we're gonna get into the Battle of Saratoga, and oh my god, just like Lexington and Concord, this is the worst trail of the Battle of Saratoga I've ever seen in my life. Now you may be thinking, wait, how can you screw up talking about the Battle of Saratoga? All you need to talk about is Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, and then you're golden. Those are the only two things you have to talk about. Those two things, the two major battles that made up the greater Battle of Saratoga, yeah, never mentioned once. You want to know what we do talk about, though?
A new type of soldier with new weapons and new rules of war.
Yeah, that's what we talk about. We don't talk about the Continental Army's battles at Freeman's Farm or Bemis Heights. We talk about how a bunch of militiamen with quote-unquote new rules of war are winning the battle. They're gonna talk about how, oh, these men didn't fight in lines, they didn't play by the rules, they targeted officers, and it's like, that's not new. Those aren't new rules of war. Light infantry tactics at this point had existed for decades. Targeting officers, for as long as war has existed, since the Stone Age, officers have been being targeted by soldiers. It's natural to target officers. They're the heads of communication. We didn't invent that. That was invented by ancient Bronze Age people in the Arabian desert. Light infantry with rifles. That's something that has existed for decades at this point. Light infantry tactics are not new. Camping out in trees and buildings, these are not new.
So this army came together, an army of militia, an army of woodsmen, an army of sharpshooters. And we didn't play by the rules.
Yes, we did. We did play by the rules. This is probably the biggest example in this documentary of what I was talking about earlier, with this honestly insulting hero worship of militia. Oh, we were an army of militia. We were an army of skirmishers. No, we weren't. We have to remember that the majority, the biggest fronts and blows of the war were taken by the Continental Army, the Americans who fought in lines, the Americans who utilized linear infantry tactics. The biggest victories of the war were won by the Continental Army, the guys who fought in lines against the British, who fought in lines. This was the age of linear warfare. And it seems as though in every single piece of media that exists, The Patriot, for example, the militia are just shown to be like these heroes, these geniuses, and the Continental Army is shown to be like these pathetic lowlives who aren't capable of fighting a battle at all. It's insulting. I say that as the son of a veteran. It's insulting to see the military be treated like it's a joke. The Continental Army was the reason why we won the war. If we relied on militia and skirmishers the whole war, we would have lost.
Morgan's men are armed with American long rifles. They're lightweight, with a slender barrel at least 40 inches long, and fire a 50 caliber shot a half-inch wide.
That is very true. They got the information about the long rifle very right.
Based on a German hunting weapon, the guns have a unique American innovation. Moves inside the barrel that spin the shot, stabilizing it, giving it deadly accuracy.
Alright, so the first thing they say, that the long rifle was based on a German hunting rifle. The long rifle was a German hunting rifle. So the long rifle, it was created in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, but it was not created by Americans. It was created by German gunsmiths who immigrated from the territories of the Holy Roman Empire to America, and people who, learned their craft in Germany. And also a unique American innovation, grooving the barrel of the gun. So they're talking about rifling. They're talking about the process of rifling, which is, grooving the interior of a barrel to make your round more accurate. Yeah, that's not an American innovation. In fact, rifling your weapon is older than even the very idea of America. It's actually older than the very idea of the 13 colonies, for that matter. Rifled weapons have existed since, I think, the late 16th century. I think the first rifled muskets were created in the late 16th century. And again, they were created in Germany. The Germans have a real knack for weaponsmithing, apparently. This is not to bring down these skirmishers in particular. This is more or less to debunk this sort of political bias towards America against anyone else, really. I don't really get the point of this. It's just straight up lying.
The tactic of assassinating officers appalls the British.
No, it didn't. The British were very much used to killing other officers with their own skirmish units. It didn't appall the British. It might have annoyed the British because they were losing officers. Like, targeting officers, it's very rustic and inept. No. This is such an awful dramatization of, what happened. So what they're trying to do here is they're trying to assassinate that British officer. But why are the British just standing there? They're just standing there, not doing anything. At this point, what they should be doing is they should have either their bayonets fixed, and they should be advancing towards the wood line to try and drive out the people in it that they can't see, but are obviously there, or they could be file firing and lay down suppressive fire and keep the Americans pinned down from firing. Hell, they could just be standard volley firing right now for all I care. Why aren't they doing anything? They're just standing there like robots. That is not how the British Army would have operated at the time. Not at all. This is an awful dramatization.
The third hits home.
I'd argue that whoever fired the bullet that took out Simon Fraser, as much as any founding father to establish American independence.
False. So yeah, the reason why I say this is wrong, just straight up wrong, is because Simon Fraser's role in the Battle of Saratoga was an overall, I wouldn't say minor one, but it was a pretty unimportant role to how the battle ended up turning out. So Simon Fraser was the commander of, I think, the British left wing during the Battle of Freeman's Farm, and despite being killed during the battle, like it's shown here, the British still won that battle. They still won the Battle of Freeman's Farm. I don't know. This statement right here is just...
Baron von Steuben is an ex-Prussian army officer, an elite soldier whose career is said to have been ruined by his homosexuality.
Yeah, actually, there's really nothing here to complain about. This is actually very good. You see, everyone always likes to talk about Lafayette, for example. And while Lafayette was definitely a very important figure in American history, people like von Steuben and even lesser known people like Casimir Piłsudski, I think that was his name, who was a Polish guy, no, they were very equally as important to winning the war as Lafayette was. Von Steuben in particular, he is responsible for creating what is known as the von Steuben military drill, which was essentially the drill that carried the American army from 1777 all the way through the war. Before that, the American army was operating on a hodgepodge of British handbooks and general training. But now, after von Steuben comes along, they have a unified drill on how to train and how to prepare for combat. And also, yeah, von Steuben was exiled from Prussia and also France for his rumored homosexuality. That absolutely is true. So skipping ahead a little, we're finally at the Battle of Yorktown, which is where this documentary ends. They don't go over the peace deal, they don't go over the Battle of Gibraltar over in Spain, for example. The last battle of the war was actually fought in India, but whatever, it's not important. What is important is that we are here at Yorktown and we're in the final home stretch.
Remains of the British Army is under siege in Yorktown.
Okay, so it kind of makes it out like what remains of the British Army is at Yorktown. Maybe they misspoke, or they were just trying to sound dramatic, but no, the British at Yorktown were not the remnants of the British Army. It's not like Star Wars, like the Imperial Remnant. This was the army led by General Cornwallis, and it was one of the two major armies at the time that was stationed in what was then the continental US, the 13 colonies. You also had the British Army led by Lord Henry up in New York, which was actually a much larger army than the army down south in Yorktown. So, no, this wasn't like the remnants or the final hurrah of the British.
Behind Yorktown's defenses, 9,000 battle-hardened British troops are waiting. They're protected by a series of outlying cannon forts called redoubts. Just 2 remain. If they're captured and their guns turned on Yorktown, the British will be forced to surrender.
Yeah, that's true. By the late stages of the Battle of Yorktown, this was very much what the situation was like for the British. They had only 2 of their redoubt fortifications left on the battlefield. Essentially, if those fell, the battle was over. So yeah, no, very important that they were held at all costs by the British. And very important that the Patriots take them at all costs. And not just the Patriots, but also the French, because during the Battle of Yorktown, about half of the total Allied force present at Yorktown was French infantry regiments that were fighting alongside Continental infantry. So it's not even a matter of it's important that the Patriots take them, it's a matter of importance that the Allied force of French and Americans take the redoubts at all cost.
A force of 400 break through and storm the British fort.
Yeah, that's true. Are we going to cover the French charge on the other redoubt? Given the time we have left, I guess we're not. Lesson learned, the French didn't do shit. Is this supposed to be a redoubt? This little trench-looking thing? I mean, if that's what you want to run with, okay, I guess.
The British surrender and begin negotiations for peace.
2 days later, the British surrender. That's true. 2 days later, the British did surrender. In fact, Cornwallis surrendered. And then negotiations begin for peace? Can you imagine how funny it would be if, like, Cornwallis was just sitting there on his iPhone and he just texted Frederick North, like, oh, yeah, by the way, yeah, we kind of surrendered at Yorktown. Mr. North, I think you should just surrender, honestly. And then North just texts back, like, oh my god, this is so cringe, bro. Why did you get captured? Fine, we'll begin peace negotiations. Like, dude, this is the 18th century. Peace negotiations didn't just instantly start. And not even just because of communications and logistical issues. Peace negotiations didn't start in 1781 because there were still multiple other wars the British was fighting. The British were still fighting their war against France. They were still fighting their war against Spain. And Spain wouldn't let up until 1783, I think. Peace negotiations didn't start in earnest for a while.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Great words, Mr. Washington. But yeah, no, that was a small little overview of episode 1 and 2 of America, the Story of Us. The worst documentary that the History Channel has ever produced, in my opinion. I don't really know how well of a job I did covering it. Honestly, just go watch it for yourself and just see how bad it is yourself, because it's not a good documentary. And if you're, say, a scholar in the American Revolution, or you just have an interest in it, you're like an American Revolution buff, you are probably going to hate this a lot more than I did. So just be warned. Yeah, no, reaction's over. Taleo then.